Hey guys, welcome to another reaction video titled The Origin of Black America, Culture and Ebonics by Thomas Sowell. I've listened to this guy a couple of times and I think I found his content very interesting. So I want to know more about the origin of Black America because I am black and I want to know where the Black Americans come from the right source. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit the subscription button and like it. That wasting of time. Let's dive to the reaction.
This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. They boast and lack self-restraint, Olmsted said, after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differed in some ways as to the causes. Professor David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed, for example, challenges the Celtic connection thesis put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior, including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city, which sounds so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries, or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspects of this subculture. However, what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been. Centuries before black pride became a fashionable phrase, there was cracker pride, and it was very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavioral standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might be even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less an insult, combined with a willingness to erupt into violence over it. New Englanders were baffled about this kind of pride among crackers. Observing such people, the Yankees could not understand what they had to feel proud about. However, this kind of pride is perhaps best illustrated by an episode reported in Professor McWhiney's Cracker Culture. When an Englishman, tired of waiting for a Southerner to start working on a house he had contracted to build, hired another man to do the job, the enraged Southerner, who considered himself dishonored, vowed, "Tomorrow morn I will come with men and 20 rifles, and I will have your life or you shall have mine."
Wow.
In the vernacular of our later times, he had been dissed, and he was not going to stand for it, regardless of the consequences for himself or others. The history of the antebellum South is full of episodes showing the same pattern, whether expressed in the highly formalized duels of the aristocracy or in the no-holds-barred style of fighting called rough and tumble among the common folk, a style that included biting off ears and gouging out eyes. It was not simply that particular isolated individuals did such things. Social approval was given to these practices, as illustrated by this episode in the antebellum South. A crowd gathered and arranged itself in an impromptu ring. The contestants were asked if they wished to fight fair or rough and tumble. When they chose rough and tumble, a roar of approval rose from the multitude. This particular fight ended with the loser's nose bitten off, his ears torn off, and both his eyes gouged out, after which the victor himself, maimed and bleeding, was chaired round the grounds to the cheers of the crowd. This rough and tumble style of fighting was also popular in the southern highlands of Scotland, where grabbing an opponent's testicles and attempting to castrate him by hand was also an accepted practice. Scottish Highlanders were, in centuries past, part of the Celtic fringe, or North Britons, outside the orbit of English culture, not only as it existed in England, but also in the Scottish lowlands. The Highlanders lagged far behind the lowlanders in education and economic progress, as well as in the speaking of the English language, for Gaelic was still widely spoken by Highlanders in the 19th century, not only in Scotland itself, but also in North Carolina and in Australia, where immigrants from the Scottish Highlands were unable to communicate with English-speaking people, including lowland Scots who had also immigrated. In the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, Gaelic had still not completely died out in the middle of the 20th century. What is important in the pride and violence patterns among rednecks and crackers was not that particular people did particular things at particular times and places, nor is it necessary to attempt to quantify such behavior. What is crucial is that violence growing out of such pride had social approval. As Professor McWhiney pointed out, men often killed and went free in the South, just as in earlier times they had in Ireland and Scotland. As one observer in the South noted, enemies would meet, exchange insults, and one would shoot the other down. The southern backcountry were similar to those of northwestern England. Meanwhile, the region of England from which New Englanders came had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in England, just as their descendants had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in the United States. Women dressed more revealingly in the South, and both sexes spoke more freely about sex than was common in New England. In the 17th century, most Virginia girls found a husband by the age of 17, while in Massachusetts, the average age at which women married was 23. In that era, fornication and rape were acts severely punished in New England. Rape was a hanging offense in New England, while in the Chesapeake Bay colonies, it was sometimes punished less severely than petty theft. As with other North-South differences in sexual behavior have often been attributed to the existence of slavery in the South, due in this case to the opportunities which this presented for sexual exploitation of slave women. But again, history shows the same patterns among the same people and their ancestors in Britain, before they had ever seen a black woman. In colonial Virginia as well, the sexual exploitation of white indentured servant girls was common before the slave population had grown large enough for white servant girls to be replaced by black women. Religious denominations, practices, and churches differed as between the crackers and rednecks of the South and those of the white population in the rest of the country. As in other things, the greatest contrast was with the role of religion in New England. This did not mean that there was uniformity across the South, for the Virginia elite tended to be Anglicans, and there were also Quakers in the South, for example. But most Southerners were either Baptists or Methodists. Those Northerners or foreigners who visited the South found the style and manner of religion among most white Southerners distinct and distasteful. These visitors viewed with contempt people who whooped and hollered, chewed and spit tobacco in church. Many Southern religious gatherings were not held in churches, but at outdoor camp meetings, a style that went back to practices of these Southerners' ancestors in Britain. So too did the oratorical style of Southern preachers and the behavior of their congregations, whether in churches or outdoors. Frederick Law Olmsted's description of a typical preacher in the antebellum South noted that the speaker nearly all the time cried aloud at the utmost stretch of his voice, as if calling to someone a long distance off, that he was gifted with a strong imagination and possessed of a good deal of dramatic power, that he had the habit of frequently repeating a phrase, and that he exhibited a dramatic talent that included leaning far over the desk with his arms stretched forward, gesticulating violently, yelling at the highest key, and catching his breath with an effort. Similar scenes were described a century earlier in Virginia, and at a camp meeting in Scotland, where the preacher was sweating, bawling, jumping, and beating the desk. This melodramatic and emotional oratorical style could still be seen in 20th century America, not only in religious services, but also in politics, both among white Southern politicians of the Jim Crow era and among black leaders of the civil rights movement in the South and community activists in the northern ghettos. By contrast, religious services in colonial Massachusetts developed what has been called the meeting and lecture approach.
Wow.
It should be noted again that not all blacks today are part of the redneck culture. Far from it. Nor has that culture been the only culture in which blacks lived in the past. There were small but significant enclaves of New England culture introduced into southern black communities by teachers from New England who poured into the South immediately after the end of the Civil War to establish schools and to teach and acculturate the children of freed slaves. Often, these were the only schools available for black children because the South was slow to begin establishing public schools, especially for blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois called the work of these dedicated missionaries the finest thing in American history. By 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended, there were about 1,400 northern white teachers from dozens of religious missionary associations teaching black children in 975 southern schools.
Wow.
The numbers suggesting that these were mostly the kinds of one-room schoolhouses common at the time in rural areas, which is where most southern blacks lived. Just a few years later, at the end of the decade, there were more than 2,500 northern teachers in just over 2,000 schools for black children. A sample of about 1,000 of these teachers, whose origins could be traced, showed that more than 500 came directly from New England, and the others are believed to include people born in New England, but who came south directly from some other location. To put this in perspective, only 17% of the northern population lived in New England at the time. So this was a wholly disproportionate representation of New Englanders among those who began to educate newly emancipated blacks. This was a New England-led crusade, much like the pre-war abolitionist movement, and many of those who went into the postbellum South were former abolitionists. These teachers brought a wholly different culture into the South. In the words of distinguished black scholar E. Franklin Frazier, the missionaries from New England who founded the first schools for Negroes in the South left the imprint of their Puritan background upon Negro education. In addition to strict morality, these missionaries taught the Yankee virtues of industry and thrift. This cultural transformation was not incidental. The avowed purpose of the American Missionary Association was to transplant a different culture into the school and college enclaves which they established among young blacks in the South, in order to deliberately supplant the existing culture. These were deeply religious institutions, but in the New England sense, so that black students were not to indulge in the religious emotionalism of the black masses in the South. They were to be different in many other ways, as E. Franklin Frazier noted. First, students were taught to speak English correctly, and thus avoid the ungrammatical speech and dialect of the Negro masses. They were expected to be courteous, speak softly, and never exhibit the spontaneous boisterousness of ordinary Negroes. The casual Southern attitude toward sex was not tolerated. To be detected in immoral sex behavior, especially if the guilty person was a woman, meant expulsion from the school. The American Missionary Association was quite explicit in their desire to remove black youngsters from their existing culture and place them in enclaves of the culture transplanted from the North. In an 1882 essay titled Change of Environment, Dr. W. W. Patton, president of the AMA, lamented that many black children grow up in communities of prevailing ignorance, superstition, and immorality, where they live in miserable hovels, see only examples of coarseness and rudeness, and hear only a Negro dialect.
Wow.
When what was needed was a total change of environment by removing young people to places where morals are pure, where manners are refined, where language is grammatical. Far from celebrating the existing culture of the black community, Dr. Patton declared, "All improvement must be by an influence from without, which shall quicken and inspire, which shall teach and guide." This being the purpose of planting and strengthening the educational institutions which operate to change for the better the environment of the colored race in this country. Although there was another educational tradition established at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, and for many missionaries, the physical problems of overwork, illness, and poor facilities were less frustrating than their everyday dealing with the freedmen. A constant problem for teachers was student absenteeism. A pupil would attend school for a few days, disappear for a time, then come back again. Multiplied by a factor of 40 or 50, this made classroom continuity difficult. This irregularity, said one teacher, was a positive vice of the freedmen. A related weakness was unreliability. You can never depend on anything promised, went a typical complaint. Another general failing among the colored people, according to many teachers, was their tardiness at meetings, classes, church. Moreover, the proportion of these migrants coming from the Deep South, as distinguished from the Upper South, increased over time, which meant that the least educated and least acculturated became a growing proportion of the black migrant population moving into the northern cities. There were about 30,000 blacks living in Chicago in 1900, but this grew to well over 100,000 by 1920 and more than 277,000 by 1940.
Wow.
In Detroit, the black population grew from a little more than 4,000 in 1900 to more than 40,000 in 1920 and over 149,000 by 1940.
Much black people in America.
New York City's black population was a little more than 60,000 in 1900, but grew to more than 150,000 by 1920 and more than 450,000 by 1940.
Wow, that is huge.
Riding in the midst of these massive migrations, historian Carter G. Woodson predicted, "The maltreatment of the Negro will be nationalized by this exodus." That is what had happened 100 years earlier, and now it happened again. The sheer numbers of these new black migrants from the South not only overwhelmed the relatively small black populations in northern cities demographically in the early 20th century, their very different behavior patterns shocked both blacks and whites at the time, as witnessed by adverse comments from earlier black settlers and the black press, denouncing the new arrivals from the South as vulgar, rowdy, unwashed, and criminal. Nor were these conclusions without foundation. For example, a study in early 20th century Pennsylvania found that the rate of violent crimes by blacks who had migrated there was nearly 5 times the rate of such crimes by blacks born in Pennsylvania. In Washington, the rate of births out of wedlock more than doubled with a large influx of Southern blacks during the late 19th century. One indication of the white reaction was that blacks no longer remained as free to live in white neighborhoods.
Wow.
This represented a major retrogression in race relations.
So
in the late 19th century, racial
in
segregation in housing in northern cities was no longer what it had once been, or what it would become again in the years ahead. In Detroit, as early as 1860, no neighborhood was even 50% black. In Chicago, as late as 1910, more than 2/3 of the black population lived in neighborhoods where most residents were white. But after the mass migrations of blacks from the South, attempts by blacks to move into white neighborhoods in Chicago were met with violence, including bombings.
Wow.
New York, Philadelphia, and Washington were also cities which began to restrict blacks to ghettos only after the massive influx of Southern blacks and their redneck culture.
Interesting.
In many cities, blacks were prevented from moving into existing white neighborhoods, but in other cases, whites simply moved out when blacks moved in. Harlem, the first of the great northern black ghettos, was still predominantly white as late as 1910. Racial segregation in housing became an explicit law in Baltimore in 1911. In one way or another, residential segregation became the norm in northern cities. Residential segregation was not the only retrogression in race relations during this period. In some northern and midwestern cities where schools had been racially integrated for years, black children were now segregated from white children after the mass influx of blacks from the South. Blacks in Washington were no longer allowed in white theaters, restaurants, or hotels, and their opportunities to work in white-collar occupations shrank. W.E.B. Du Bois summarized these retrogressions this way: "Yet it has everywhere been manifest in the long run that while a part of the Negroes were native-born and trained in the culture of the city, the others were immigrants largely ignorant and unused to city life. There were, of course, manifold exceptions, but this was the rule. Thus, the history of the Negro in northern cities is the history of the rise of a small group by accretion from without, but at the same time periodically overwhelmed by them and compelled to start over again when once the material had been assimilated." In Philadelphia, for example, the native-born blacks had advanced, but, according to Du Bois, they were overwhelmed and dragged back by black migrants from the South. He added, "In New York, the native-born have been perhaps even more completely overwhelmed." This pattern is confirmed in places where the retrogression in race relations took place at a different time because of local differences in the timing of large-scale in-migration of blacks from the South. In San Francisco, for example, that mass influx took place during the Second World War, as blacks from the South were attracted by jobs in new war production facilities, notably the Kaiser shipyards. Henry Kaiser recruited Southern blacks and brought them to the San Francisco Bay Area by the trainloads. The black population of San Francisco, which had been less than 5,000 in 1940, rose to more than 40,000 by the time of the 1950 census. And the black populations of Oakland and Berkeley also rose several-fold during the same decade. In the San Francisco Bay Area, as in the northern cities half a century earlier, there was a long-settled black population which lived free of the Jim Crow laws and practices of the South, and which had been able to get civil service jobs as far back as the 1920s. But although the newcomers were skilled workers more often than the local black residents, culturally, the newcomers lagged far behind. Native-born blacks in the Bay Area described the newcomers as foreign in the way they talked and in their behavior. For example, eating hamburgers openly on the bus, and bologna, and loud talking and fighting on the buses.
So eating in the buses is not a problem.
Some of the new blacks from the South were described as having a little more of a chip on their shoulder than the people out here did. Many local blacks thought that white racism increased after World War II, when both Southern blacks and Southern whites began arriving in large numbers. A similar retrogression in race relations on the Pacific Coast during the Second World War occurred in Portland, Oregon, where again there were large influxes of black workers to take jobs in the growing war industries. These new black arrivals with little education were resented by the small group of law-abiding and self-sustaining Negroes already living in Portland. As in other places and times, a ghetto now developed in Portland, and discriminations in regard to civil rights were instituted. On the national scene, the much later receding of racism and the socioeconomic advancement of blacks in the second half of the 20th century cannot be attributed simply to the passage of time, for the passage of time had produced major retrogressions in race relations before. Nor can these advances be attributed to the civil rights laws that began in the 1960s, for the advancement of blacks antedated any serious civil rights legislation by years, and was in fact more dramatic in the years preceding such legislation. Between 1940 and 1960, the percent of black families with incomes below the official poverty line fell from 87% to 47%. In various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. The principal factor that raised black incomes during that period, both absolutely and relative to white income, was migration, from low-income areas to higher-income areas. However much these migrations set back those blacks who were already living in northern cities, this movement from the South put millions of blacks into places where their children would get better education, while their parents had better job opportunities. With the passing years and generations, more and more of these migrant families ceased to be black rednecks, acculturating themselves in new surroundings, as minority groups tend to do in countries around the world. Once again, racial barriers began to erode after World War II and before the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Perhaps the most dramatic example was the crumbling of racial barriers in professional sports, exemplified by Jackie Robinson's becoming the first black Major League Baseball player in 1947, 17 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A poll that year showed his popularity to be second only to longtime entertainment idol Bing Crosby. The process of ending racial segregation in American military services was also begun during the Truman administration, years before segregation was declared unlawful in civilian life. In 1948, President Harry Truman ran for re-election on a platform that included civil rights for blacks, which some thought would doom his candidacy. But the fact that he won suggests that white public opinion had already begun to change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dealt major blows to racial restrictions, especially in the South, and had dramatic effects on the number of black elected officials. Economically, however, the upward trends in black income and occupations that had begun decades earlier simply continued, but at no accelerated rate. The rise of blacks into professional and other high-level occupations was in fact greater in the years preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the years afterward, and was greater in the 1940s than in the 1950s. Behind such developments was the fact that blacks were closing the gap between themselves and whites in years of schooling during this era. In short, major social transformations within the black community were having an impact in their economic condition. It would hardly be surprising if it also had an impact on how whites viewed blacks, as had happened in the 19th century. The civil rights legislation of the 1960s may well have been an effect of the rise of blacks, rather than the sole or predominant cause of that rise, as it has been represented as being by those leaders, black and white, with incentives to magnify their own role in racial progress. The difference between cultural explanations of changing race relations and explanations based on political acts or swings of the pendulum in white public opinion is not just a matter of intellectual preference. There are wholly different implications, not only about the past, but especially about the future. The question is whether the advancement of blacks is helped or hindered by promoting a black identity built around a redneck culture whose track record has been largely negative for both blacks and white.
Wow, this is a very interesting topic to listen to. It is very deep, very deep to know about black culture, origin of Black America. As in, this whole thing is, to me, a lot of Black America I saw there was looking similar like West Africa or North Africa, because you can see the resemblance there when they show the picture. I don't know, this is really very deep. I can't even say a lot because this is I need to deep more on research about black. I know during the slave trade they took a lot of people from Africa to America, so the origin of them definitely is from our African country, maybe West Africa, North Africa, East Africa, depend. But majority we are taken from West Africa. The black person moving in a white community, the white person will move out simply because it's black. As oh, this is racist, you know, meaning they don't want to associate with anything black. They only want to be only the white community. I mean, I don't know. I don't really see it like we are not different. We are all one God's creature. God creates us. The only difference is just the color. We have one life, the same breeds, one, everything is equal. So I don't really know why they treated them so badly. I hope it's not like this anymore, or perhaps in some community this kind of a thing is still going on. I don't know. I'm not living in America. I know there are a large number of black people living in America, just like the places he mentioned, New York City and co. A lot. And I think they have a good life now. Everything is equal. Black man, white man can live together in the same community, not being scared or not being racist. You know, at least black are also human beings. Black life also matters. Like I say, this is a very deep topic, really deep. You know, so I need to just research on more or watch or listen more of it. Yeah, guys. Anyway, we look up to God and we hope our leaders make things right. We really hope our leaders make things. So guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on my next video. Bye.